The sky split open with fire. Not metaphorical fire, literal flames that consumed 7,000 sheep in seconds, turning wool and flesh to ash before the shepherds could even scream. The few servants who escaped the inferno ran toward Job's estate with soot-blackened faces and the smell of burnt offerings clinging to their robes. They didn't know they were already too late. They didn't know that while they ran, raiders from the east had descended on Job's camels, 3,000 of them, slaughtering the young men who tended them and driving the animals into the wilderness. They didn't know that another band of marauders had swept down on the oxen and donkeys, 500 yoke of each, butchering every servant except one who would live just long enough to deliver the news. And they certainly didn't know about the house where all 10 of Job's children had gathered for a feast, the house where the oldest son hosted his brothers and sisters, where wine flowed and laughter echoed, where young men and women who had never known want or suffering celebrated another day of abundance. The house that stood one moment and collapsed into rubble the next when a wind that came from nowhere and everywhere, struck all 4 corners simultaneously and brought the walls down on every soul inside. 4 messengers arrived at Job's door in the span of minutes. Each brought news of total devastation. Each story began the same way. I alone have escaped to tell you. And each ended with death. Death of servants, death of livestock, death of wealth, death of legacy, death of children. This is where most stories about faith would begin. But the story of Job actually starts earlier, in a place humans cannot see, in a conversation we were never meant to hear, in a cosmic courtroom, where the fate of one man becomes the testing ground for a question that still haunts theology 25 centuries later. Can a human being love God for nothing? This story appears in the Book of Job, one of the oldest texts in the Hebrew Bible, likely written between the 7th and 4th centuries BCE, though the events it describes may be set even earlier in the patriarchal period. The opening chapters, Job 1-2, establish the framework of the test, while chapters 3-41 contain the philosophical wrestling that follows, and chapter 42 provides the resolution. What you're about to experience is a dramatic retelling that remains faithful to the biblical text, while bringing the psychological and spiritual dimensions of this ancient narrative into vivid focus. Job lived in the land of Uz, likely somewhere in the region of Edom, southeast of Israel, a place mentioned in Lamentations 4:21 and Genesis 10:23. The biblical text introduces him with language reserved for moral paragons. He was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Job 1:1. This wasn't self-righteous piety. Job's righteousness was recognized by God himself, a fact that becomes crucial to understanding what follows. His wealth was staggering even by ancient Near Eastern standards. 7,000 sheep meant he controlled wool production for entire regions. 3,000 camels represented not just wealth, but international trade connections, as camels were the transport vehicles for long-distance commerce. 500 yoke of oxen, that's 1,000 animals, indicated vast agricultural holdings. 500 female donkeys suggested breeding operations that would generate income for generations. His household included numerous servants, and the text specifically mentions 7 sons and 3 daughters, numbers that carried symbolic weight in ancient Hebrew culture, suggesting completeness and divine blessing. But here's what makes Job remarkable. He was spiritually vigilant about his children. After each round of their feasts, Job would rise early and offer burnt offerings for each of them, thinking, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Job 1:5. This wasn't helicopter parenting. This was a father who understood that material prosperity could become a spiritual hazard, who knew that abundance could breed forgetfulness of the source of all good things. Job's world was ordered, prosperous, and morally coherent. He followed the principle that ancient wisdom literature taught: righteousness leads to blessing, wickedness to curse. His life was living proof of the equation. Then came the day described in Job 1:6, when everything we think we understand about divine justice gets shattered. The scene shifts to a realm humans don't naturally inhabit. One day, the text says with unsettling casualness, the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Job 1:6. The Hebrew term sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, refers to heavenly beings, divine council members, angels, though ancient readers would have understood them as part of God's royal court, reporting on their activities in the created order. Among them came the Satan, in Hebrew Ha-Satan, which means the adversary or the accuser. This isn't yet the cosmic villain of later Christian theology. In Job, Satan functions more like a prosecuting attorney, a divine skeptic whose role is to test the genuineness of human devotion. He's been roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it, Job 1-7, like a detective gathering evidence. God initiates the conversation, a detail that's easy to miss but theologically explosive. "Have you considered my servant Job?" God asks. "There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Job 1:8. Think about this. The Almighty, the creator of the universe, is essentially bragging about Job to Satan, the being whose entire function is to challenge and accuse. Satan's response cuts to the core of every religious person is secret doubt. Does Job fear God for nothing? Job 1:9. The question is brilliant in its cynicism. Satan argues that Job's faith is transactional, a sophisticated form of self-interest. "You've put a hedge around him," Satan says, pointing out the divine protection that surrounded Job and his household and everything he has. "You've blessed the work of his hands so his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." Job 1-10-11. This is the gauntlet thrown down. Satan claims that human devotion to God is always ultimately selfish, that faith is just an insurance policy, that worship is just sophisticated bribery. We praise God because we expect things in return. God accepts the challenge. "Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." Job 1:12. The terms are set, the hedge is removed, and Satan goes forth to do his work. The permission God grants here has troubled theologians for millennia. How can a good God allow such suffering? But the text presents this as a cosmic test case. If there exists even one human being who loves God, apart from personal advantage, then love itself is vindicated, and the entire relationship between creator and creation has a foundation in something real rather than transactional. Job has no idea any of this has happened. He wakes that morning a wealthy man, a blessed man, a father of 10, surrounded by evidence that the universe operates according to moral logic. He will not go to bed that way. The catastrophes strike with choreographed precision, detailed in Job 1:13-19. The biblical narrator presents them in rapid sequence, each messenger barely finishing before the next arrives. This literary technique creates breathless urgency, replicating for the reader the psychological assault Job experiences. First messenger. The oxen were ploughing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Job 1:14-15. The Sabeans were likely raiders from Sheba, in what is now Yemen, known for their aggression. In one stroke, Job's agricultural wealth is gone. While he was still speaking, the text emphasizes the overlap. Second messenger. The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Job 1:16. This wasn't a natural wildfire. The servant calls it the fire of God, perhaps lightning, perhaps something more supernatural. The language echoes what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, 7,000 sheep gone in flames. While he was still speaking, third messenger. The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Job 1:17. The Chaldeans, from what would later become Babylonia, were notorious bandits. 3,000 camels, representing years of breeding and trade connections, stolen. While he was still speaking, fourth messenger. And this one brings news that transcends property loss. Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Job 1:18-19. All 10 children dead, in one moment. The pattern here is significant. The attacks alternate between human agency, Sabaeans, Chaldeans, and natural disaster, fire, wind, making it impossible to explain away as simply bad luck or human malice. The destruction comes from multiple directions simultaneously. The only consistency is that one servant survives each attack, just enough to ensure Job receives the news, to ensure he knows the full extent of what he's lost. Job's response, recorded in Job 1:20-21, is one of the most famous passages in Scripture. At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Read that again. Job worshipped. In the moment of total devastation, he fell down and worshipped. He didn't curse God, he didn't demand explanations. He acknowledged God's sovereignty over both giving and taking, and he blessed God's name. The narrator adds this crucial note. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Job 1:22. Round 1 goes to Job. Satan's thesis, that human faith is purely transactional, appears to be wrong. Job has loved God for nothing, receiving nothing but loss in return, and yet he maintains his integrity. But Satan isn't finished. Job 2:1-6 describes another scene in the divine council, almost identical to the first. One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. God again asks where Satan has been, receives the same answer, and then points to Job again. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." That last phrase, "without any reason," is devastating. God acknowledges that Job's suffering has no cause in Job's behavior. This isn't punishment. This isn't correction. This is, from Job's perspective, utterly senseless. Satan's response reveals a deeper cynicism. Skin for skin. A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. Job 2:4-5. The argument shifts. Fine, Satan concedes. Maybe people can endure loss of property and even children if they themselves remain healthy. But take away physical well-being, afflict the body itself with suffering, and the veneer of faith will crack. A person can maintain theological composure when the pain is external, but when it invades their own flesh, when every breath hurts, when sleep brings no rest, when the body becomes a prison of agony, then Satan argues genuine faith becomes impossible. God accepts this second challenge too, with one crucial limitation. "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." Job 2:1-6. What follows is described with clinical brevity in Job 2:1-7. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. The medical details unfold throughout the subsequent chapters. These weren't minor skin irritations. Job 2:8 says he took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. Ancient readers would recognize this. Job moved to the ash heap outside the city, the place where society's untouchables lived, lepers, outcasts, the ritually unclean. His condition made him repulsive, possibly contagious, socially dead, even though biologically alive. Later passages describe his symptoms more fully. His skin grew black and peeled off, Job 30:30. Worms infested his sores, Job 7:5. He experienced terrifying nightmares, Job 7:14. His breath became offensive, Job 19:17. His bones protruded visibly, Job 19:20. He endured constant pain day and night, Job 30:17. His face was red from weeping, Job 16:16. And he could barely eat, Job 3:24. Modern medical speculation suggests something like pemphigus vulgaris, a severe autoimmune disorder, or perhaps multiple conditions striking simultaneously. But the biblical description keeps the focus on Job's comprehensive physical degradation. The man who had everything now had nothing, no wealth, no children, no health, sitting in ashes, scraping his rotting skin with broken pottery, visible from the city walls as a warning of how far a person can fall. Then came his wife. Her appearance in Job 2:9 is brief but crucial. His wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." For centuries, interpreters have vilified Job's wife, portraying her as a temptress like Eve. But read her words more carefully. She's not being cruel, she's being merciful. She sees her husband suffering with no hope of recovery. All 10 of her children are dead. Her world has collapsed too. "Curse God and die," she says. "Invoke divine judgment. Bring this nightmare to an end. Stop prolonging the agony." It's a temptation masked as compassion. Job's response in Job 2:10 cuts through the fog of despair. "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" The narrator adds, "In all this, Job did not sin in what he said." Round 2 also goes to Job. His body is destroyed, but his faith remains intact. He has lost absolutely everything that makes life worth living by ancient standards: wealth, children, health, social standing, and yet he refuses to curse God. But something has shifted. Job has passed Satan's test, but Satan essentially disappears from the narrative after chapter 2. The cosmic courtroom fades away, and Job is left sitting in ashes, faithful but destroyed, righteous but ruined, maintaining integrity while his world disintegrates around him. Now comes the long middle section of the book, chapters 3 through 41, where Job and his friends wrestle with the theological implications of innocent suffering. This is where the drama deepens from external crisis to internal anguish. 3 friends arrive to comfort Job: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. Job 2:11. Their initial response is remarkable. When they see Job from a distance, they barely recognize him. They weep aloud, tear their robes, sprinkle dust on their heads, and then, most significantly, they sit with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights without speaking a word. Because they saw how great his suffering was. Job 2:13. This silent presence is the most helpful thing they do. In their silence, they honor the magnitude of Job's pain. They don't rush to explanations. They simply sit with suffering, which is often the most honest response to trauma. But then Job speaks. In chapter 3, he breaks the silence with a curse, not a curse on God, but a curse on his own birth. "May the day of my birth perish, and the night that said, 'A boy is conceived.'" Job 3:3. He wishes for cosmic annihilation, for the day he was born to be erased from the calendar, for that night to be barren and hear no cry of joy. He longs for death, wishes he'd been stillborn, asks why light is given to those in misery and life to the bitter of soul. Job 3:20. This unleashes a series of speeches that dominate the rest of the book. The friends take turns arguing variations of the same theme. Suffering must be punishment for sin. This was the cornerstone of ancient wisdom theology, the principle of retribution, where good deeds bring blessings and evil deeds bring curses. If Job is suffering, he must have sinned. The question isn't whether he's guilty, but which sins he's committed. Eliphaz starts gently in chapters 4 to 5, appealing to mystical visions and suggesting Job's suffering might be divine discipline meant to restore him. But as Job refuses to confess, the friends grow harsher. Bildad in chapter 8 essentially tells Job his children died because they sinned, Job 8:4, a theological cruelty that turns grief into guilt. Zophar in chapter 11 straight up accuses Job of having secret sins God is punishing, Job 11:6. The pattern repeats through 3 cycles of speeches. Each friend makes increasingly aggressive accusations. Each time Job defends his integrity. He doesn't claim to be sinless in an absolute sense. He acknowledges human imperfection, but he insists his suffering is disproportionate to any wrongdoing. He knows the equation doesn't work. Righteous people do suffer. Wicked people do prosper. The moral architecture of the universe his friends describe doesn't match observable reality. Job's speeches become increasingly desperate. He begs for death, chapter 6, complains that his life is meaningless, chapter 7, sarcastically tells God to leave him alone, chapter 7, 16-19, demands a trial where he can present his case, chapter 13, and at his lowest point wishes there were a mediator between himself and God, someone who could negotiate this impossible situation, Job 9:33. But Job also makes astonishing declarations of faith that burst through his despair. In Job 13:15 he says, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face." In Job 19:25-27 he makes one of Scripture's most profound statements. "I know that my Redeemer lives and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes. I and not another. How my heart yearns within me." This is theological vertigo. Job swings between despair and hope, between wanting to die and believing he'll be vindicated, between accusing God of injustice and affirming God's ultimate righteousness. He's not a flat character reciting pieties. He's a human being in extremis, wrestling with questions that have no easy answers. The friends represent conventional theology failing in real time. Their explanations don't work. Their comfort doesn't comfort. They come to help and end up adding to Job's burden, which is why God later tells them, "You have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." Job 42:7. A fourth friend, Elihu, appears in chapters 32-37, younger and angrier than the others. He's outraged that Job would dare justify himself rather than God, and he's angry the older friends couldn't refute Job's arguments. Elihu tries a different approach, arguing that God uses suffering to prevent sin, to discipline to reveal truth, but he still operates within the retribution framework. Then, just when the theological arguments seem exhausted, just when human wisdom has failed completely, God himself arrives to answer Job. Except God doesn't answer Job's questions at all. Job 38 begins with cosmic thunder. "Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm." Out of the storm, the Hebrew is out of the whirlwind, the same kind of violent weather that killed Job's children, now becomes the medium for divine revelation. God doesn't send a prophet. He doesn't communicate through visions. He shows up directly, speaking from the chaos itself. What follows across chapters 38-41 is one of the most magnificent passages in world literature. But it's not what anyone expected. Job wanted a trial, a chance to argue his case, an explanation for his suffering. He wanted to know why. God's response is essentially, "Who are you to even ask? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know." Job 38:4-5. The questions cascade. Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Have you entered the storehouses of snow? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Job 38:18, 22, 32, 35. God takes Job on a tour of creation, pointing to phenomena Job doesn't understand and cannot control. Mountain goats giving birth, Job 39:1. Wild donkeys roaming free, Job 39:5. The ostrich's strange behavior, Job 39:13-18. The warhorse's fearlessness, Job 39:19-25. The hawk's flight, Job 39:26. The eagle soaring to heights, Job 39:27. Then God describes two creatures in detail. Behemoth, Job 40:15-24, possibly a hippopotamus or perhaps a mythological creature representing chaos, and Leviathan, Job 41, a sea monster representing untamable primal forces. These descriptions emphasize that God created and controls powers Job cannot even imagine confronting. The message isn't cruel, it's recalibrating. Job has been operating under the assumption that he deserves answers, that God owes him an explanation, that the universe should be comprehensible to human moral categories. God's response is to reveal the vast gap between human understanding and divine knowledge, between our tiny perspective and cosmic reality. God never mentions Satan, never explains the cosmic test, never tells Job about the conversation in the divine council. From Job's perspective, God simply shows up and asks, "Do you really think you understand enough about how the universe works to indict me?" Job's response in Job 42:1-6 is surrender, but not defeat. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job doesn't get answers, he gets God. And somehow, in the presence of the divine, his questions become less important than the relationship itself. This is the book's profound reversal. The question isn't why do righteous people suffer, but can we trust God even when we don't understand? Job proves we can. Not because suffering makes sense, but because God is trustworthy even when circumstances aren't. The book ends with Job 42:7-17, where God vindicates Job against his friends, requiring them to offer sacrifices and asking Job to pray for them. Then comes a controversial passage where God restores Job's fortunes. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. And he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Job 42:12-13. Some readers find this ending troubling, as if it reduces the story to a transactional bargain after all. Be faithful, and eventually you'll get it all back. But notice, Job gets exactly double his original livestock. The numbers are precisely twice what he had in chapter 1, suggesting compensation or legal restitution. But he gets exactly the same number of children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, not double because children aren't replaceable commodities. The ones who died are still dead. The loss remains real. The text notes that Job's 3 daughters were the most beautiful in all the land, and unusually for ancient culture, they received inheritance along with their brothers. Job 42:15, suggesting Job's experience of loss changed how he valued his children, particularly his daughters. Job lived 140 years after his ordeal and saw 4 generations of descendants. The book ends. And so Job died, an old man and full of years. Job 42:17. The book of Job doesn't resolve the problem of suffering. It explodes simplistic solutions. Satan's challenge in chapters 1-2 frames the entire narrative. Can genuine love exist apart from self-interest? Can faith survive when it costs everything? Is worship possible without transaction? Job proves it is. He passes the test Satan designed, demonstrating that at least one human being can love God for nothing, receiving nothing, expecting nothing. This vindicates not just Job, but the entire concept of authentic relationship between creator and creation. But the book does something more radical than proving Job's integrity. It dismantles the retribution theology his friends represent, the comfortable doctrine that good people prosper and bad people suffer. The universe doesn't work that way, and pretending it does actually adds to the burden of the suffering by making them feel guilty for pain they didn't cause. Job's story acknowledges that sometimes suffering has no explanation accessible to human understanding. Sometimes the righteous do suffer catastrophically. Sometimes children die for no reason. Sometimes disease strikes the faithful. The book refuses to explain these realities away, refuses to offer false comfort, refuses to reduce cosmic complexity to human moral categories. What it offers instead is the possibility of faith that survives even when understanding fails, worship that continues even when blessing stops, trust that persists even when God seems silent. Job in the ash heap, covered with sores, having lost everything, still says, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." That's not the faith of a person expecting reward. That's the faith Satan said couldn't exist. The story positions Job in a cosmic conflict he never sees, making his faithfulness all the more remarkable. He doesn't know about the heavenly courtroom. He doesn't know he's vindicating the possibility of genuine love. He simply remains faithful in the dark, proving that authentic devotion doesn't require comprehension. This ancient text still resonates because it's honest about suffering in ways comfortable religion often isn't. It acknowledges the horror without explaining it away. It sits in the ashes before offering restoration. It lets Job rage and question and demand answers, and calls that faithfulness rather than sin. The book of Job is ultimately about whether relationship can be more foundational than transaction, whether trust can survive incomprehension, whether faith is about understanding or about loyalty when understanding fails. Job's answer, demonstrated through unimaginable loss, is yes. In a universe where suffering often makes no sense, where innocent people experience catastrophic loss, where the equation between righteousness and blessing breaks down, Job stands as testimony that genuine faith doesn't require logical coherence, only stubborn fidelity to a God who remains trustworthy even when circumstances aren't. The hook that opens this story, the sky splitting with fire, leads to one of theology's most profound explorations, that authentic love requires the possibility of loving for nothing, and that such love, tested to the breaking point, can still hold firm. Job suffered not because he sinned, but because he was righteous enough to prove that righteousness isn't ultimately about reward. His story invites every person facing inexplicable suffering to hold on, not because answers will come, but because the relationship itself, with a God who speaks from the whirlwind and yet remains present, is worth more than understanding. That's the test of faith Job passed, and the test still stands.